Hey everybody, it's me, Mr. Kenny. Today we're going to be looking at the early Middle Ages, sometimes called the Dark Ages, which is immediately following the fall of the Western Roman Empire. So let's begin. Make sure to hit that like, subscribe to pass this along so more people can see the history goodness. Anyways, we know that prior to this time, much of Europe was part of the Roman Empire. Once it was one empire, and then after Diocletian, it will be divided into two about at this line over here. So right where you see the Tiber for Tiber River, you had an imaginary line going through where we have the west over here with Germany, France, Spain, Western North Africa, and then the east, Greece, Turkey, Egypt, Syria. And we're going to see the results of the fall of the western half. Now, we know that there were groups the Romans called barbarians. Now, we know today that probably it's not right to call any group a barbarian because it was based on the Roman standard of civilization, which what makes one civilization greater than another. Both had different things to contribute and add, just different styles and ways of doing it. But the Romans, they thought they were barbarians because they weren't Roman. So we see right here in this map several different invasions that happened. And we noticed that the Western Empire had several invasions, while the Eastern really didn't have that many, which is a shame for the West, particularly because the East had more money, more, defenses, and just would have been way better equipped to deal with it. Whereas the West, this big, wide open agrarian land, was just ripe for invasion. Now, another thing to realize is that the East is going to have a unified Hellenistic culture, while the West is going to have the different cultures of the different groups that the Romans had conquered. Now, the wealthy and elite are going to assimilate and act like the Romans, whereas many of the regular people won't. So we're going to see unified culture in the East, divided cultures in the West. And what's going to happen is the peoples are going to start merging with the groups that come in. And we can just see how many different groups came into the West: Burgundians, Franks, Saxons, Angles, Britons, Slavs, Visigoths, Basques, Vandals, Alans. I mean, just to name a few, there are so many different groups. All right, so what happens when Rome falls? There is no central government. Remember, we had first the Roman Republic and then the Roman Empire, providing strong leadership for this area. Now there was no centralized person or people going and calling the shots. Also, you had Rome's legions that were going and defending it. Rome's legions are gone. When Rome goes, so do the legions. So there's no defense system. And so what happens is these groups that came in and invaded wind up setting their own little kingdoms and having wars amongst themselves and carving out their own territory, which we can see in this map here. Now, one of the things to note, when you look at any maps of the early Middle Ages, you will see different lines and different kingdom names all over, because this was a constantly evolving and changing thing. It's not like today where country boundaries and borders are much more defined. They were constantly fighting and deciding, well, who owned what where. So a lot of this is actually based on guesses from archaeological digs, from records. So you'll see many, many differences depending on which variation of the maps that you look at. So just a note when you're going and looking at this. And through time, it changed, quite dramatically. Now, one of the things we should notice when we look at Europe, we know that Europe, although it is a continent, it has its own continental plate, it's incredibly small, and it's attached to the large continent of Asia. So it's almost like a peninsula off of this, big continent, the largest continent. But then, as you continue to look at Europe, you see how many little peninsulas are on, Europe. And so what happens, that combined with rivers and mountain ranges, it creates some natural barriers for these places to go and create their own kingdoms. We're going to see groups entrenched in there and using the defenses that they can naturally to have their own kingdoms. All right. So natural boundaries help create these kingdoms. And here we just see another example of how, the map is different and changes over time. You get different groups, the Utes and the Danes, the Britons. So it just all depends on what map you look at for what you will see. Now, the most powerful group during this time, hands down, is going to be the Franks, whom I actually did a lot of my graduate studies on. So they're pretty interesting. And you look at the name Franks and we say, oh, well, that's pretty similar to France. Yeah, that's where they get the name. France gets its name from the Franks. It was the kingdom of the Franks, eventually shortened down to France. Oui, oui. Okay, so the Franks. Now, why were they successful? Why did they become so much more powerful than their competition? Well, they had this great idea. They said, what if I go and give Jaden some armor? And then what if I go put Jaden on a horse because he's going to be slowed down a little bit, and then I give him sharp, pointy things like swords and spears? They developed the use of knights, so having a small force of heavily armored and mounted soldiers, and that wound up proving to be incredibly effective against the standard foot soldier. So they used these armored warriors to conquer the land and subjugate the people. Now, the most famous of the early Frank rulers is going to be a man named Clovis, a guy who wrote a lot of papers about. Now, Clovis united the Franks. The big story with it is, of course, he went and killed just about anyone who had a claim to the throne, including many of his relatives. There's this funny speech where he's like, oh, I'm so sad. I have no one of kin, meaning related, to go and share this burden of rule with me. And really, he's trying to be like someone to be like, hey, I'm related to you, Clovis. So then he could so that there's no other people claiming the throne. Another thing that Clovis did to actually unite the Franks is he converted to Catholic Christianity. Now, we think he probably was a type of Arian Christianity, which is considered a heresy at this time. And so we think he probably had some kind of Christian roots, although other writers will say he was completely pagan. But his wife was Catholic and kept and said, I really would like you to convert to Christianity. I think it'd be the right thing to do. But Clovis was afraid because they had baptized their one son under his wife's directions, and then he had died as an infant, which was actually fairly common because of just all of the myriad of things that could kill you back then. Well, Clovis was very obstinate against this and would not convert to Christianity. But then, supposedly, he was battling a group called the Alemanni. And he's battling the Alemanni, trying to take over this territory, and the Franks are losing. And Clovis supposedly prayed and said, God, if you are real, give me victory, and then I shall convert. And then, as the story goes, much like, we have Constantine battling Maxentius and saying, under this sign you shall conquer. Clovis, then the tide of the battle changed, and Clovis won the battle. The Franks were dominant against the Alemanni. So Clovis then, we see a picture down here, becomes baptized and goes and becomes Catholic. And typically one of those things when your king adopts a new religion, the people all go and are basically considered that faith as well. So the Franks, many of them then convert to Catholic Christianity, those who already hadn't. And this is going to be a really unifying effect because what religion was the Roman Empire? Catholic Christianity. So you have the Franks, this invading group that have come in to the territory and they want to rule it. Well, there were people there. Now, yes, some of those people were killed by the Franks, but many of them were not, and they didn't leave. This was their homes. So when the invaders adopt the same religion as the people there, it brings them together. Today, we don't really see this kind of thing as much in our culture. Anyone can believe in whatever faith they would like, and we, just say you believe what you want and we get along. Back then, though, it was very much a thing where if you wanted legitimacy, you had to have the same faith as the people you ruled. And so this brings it together. Some skeptical historians say that this was solely just a political move. I wasn't there, so I can't tell you if there was a miraculous battle or not, but that's the story of Clovis, who's going to enforce Christianity like super hardcore, making sure there's one story where one of his soldiers go and they're having a battle and there's a church nearby, and one of his soldiers go in and loots the church, steals a very fancy vase, and then instead of getting caught, breaks it. And then he lines up all of his men and he goes, has this guy, they confront the guy in front of all of his soldiers. And this is the king himself going administering this justice. And he goes, bow down to your king. And as soon as he bows down, he whips out a mace and just smashes the guy's head and says, just as you did to the vase at Poitiers. Just trying to show that, the church is something we don't mess with. Anyways, moving on. There's so many good stories with Clovis. Like I said, I wrote a lot of papers about Clovis. All right, so Clovis is going to wind up increasing the territory of the Franks and unifying the Franks altogether. However, though, the Franks' succession laws and inheritance laws goes when Clovis made that mistake. Everybody seems to keep on dying. He divides his territory amongst his sons, and then the Franks will not be unified until a couple hundred years later. So we have a guy named Charles I said that weird. Charles, there we go, Martel. And he has the coolest nickname ever. He's Charles the Hammer. I mean, come on. Wouldn't that be so awesome if I was, Mr. the Hammer Kenny, I would love it. So you can let that keep on going. Anyways, he is going to unify all of the Franks. Now, at the time of Charles Martel, it was called the mayor system, and we have all of these different rulers, basically principalities, and he convinces the Franks to come together to stop the invasion of the Muslims. So we had talked about this earlier in the year, how after Muhammad had died and we have our early Umayyad Caliphate, how they are going to be going and conquering all of North Africa, and how they're going to then go from the south north into Spain and conquer Spain. And all of a sudden they stop at the Pyrenees. Why is that? Well, it's because of Charles the Hammer Martel, who manages to go and stop the invasion. Now, there are a lot of historical speculations on the stop of the Muslim invasion, between them being disorganized, not having full, whereas the Franks put up a unified fight, whereas that really hadn't happened before. But he manages to go and have his soldiers attack the baggage train, which is where all the loot that they, are able to acquire during their conquering was. And so what happens is some of the soldiers, Muslim soldiers, seeing their loot being taken, they go retreat to go protect their loot. And then, of course, it's chaos, because then you have some of your soldiers retreating. So then the soldiers that are foolish enough to stay, they wind up getting killed. They turn them, hey, where are you going, Bob? And, then sword through them. And so it winds up becoming chaos, and it's this huge victory. And I misspoke. I said at the Pyrenees. They get pushed back to the Pyrenees. It's actually the Battle of Tours, which we see pictured there. I'm so sorry. Anyways, they got all the way up to there, Tours, and then he manages to stop them. But he doesn't become king of all of the Franks. His son, Pepin, is actually going to wind up getting called that. And Pepin was called Pepin the Short. Now, whether it was he was small in stature or if he kept a short beard, which is what most historians think, because prior to Pepin, the Frankish kings had really, really long beards, and he had just a short little beard. He goes and he sends his forces to save the Pope from a group called the Lombards, who are attacking Rome. He kicks them out and then doesn't even want to keep the land. He says, oh, no, Pope, you can have this. It's how we get our papal states. And so Pepin saves the Pope, becomes king of the Franks. And, this is something that we're going to get more into later. We're going to see that the Pope and Catholicism is going to be incredibly influential and powerful in Europe this time. Because, I mean, they just went and took a guy and said, okay, you're a ruler of all of your people. And people accepted it because they believed that the Pope was able to essentially, as the title Pope is the vicar of Christ, meaning the representative of Christ on earth. So therefore, the Pope's words were Christ's, God's word. So Pepin winds up unifying the Franks, but he's actually not the one we care about. He has a son, Charlie, otherwise known later on as Charles the Great, Charles Magnus, or as we hear him, Charlemagne. Charlemagne. I love this portrait of him, and we can kind of learn a lot about Charlemagne from this picture. We see that Christianity is going to be important to him as he holds the cross. We see that he's a warrior king. We look at this crown and we see how incredibly wealthy he is. We see the intricate design and gold cloth woven into his outfit. We see the Roman eagles, because he's later even going to be considered the emperor of Rome as well. Anyways, Charlemagne becomes king of the Franks 768. He inherits from Pepin. And he's going to rule for 46 years, so he's going to rule for a very long time. And his goal was to unite all of Christian Europe. He wants to rebuild the Roman Empire. He wants to bring up all of the Christians together and have them under one government. He's going to do this two ways. He's going to do this through military and through education. Now, Charlemagne himself is going to be illiterate. The story goes he spends his whole life trying to learn how to read and maybe learning a little bit. Historians differ on whether how much he really truly learned or not, but he sets up schools, he sets up libraries. He goes and tries to have justice throughout the land. He goes and tries to make sure everyone follows Christianity. Now, if you're not going and following it, he had some issues with there. There's a Germanic group called the Saxons who Charlemagne battled time and time again. Charlemagne would come in there, defeat them in battle, kill tons of them, and say, all right, you guys better start acting Christian again. Stop being pagan. And then, they'd say, oh, yes, Charlemagne, of course, we won't do it anymore. We don't do it anymore. Then Charlemagne and his army leaves. And then, of course, they go back to following their pagan religion. And then Charlemagne comes back. Something called it's kind of a horrible story, the bloody verdict of Verdun, where Charlemagne winds up going and executing like 4,500 Saxons at the river that it ran red because he was tired of having to constantly go back and say, no, this is the faith you must follow. But in 800, he becomes crowned Roman Emperor. The title is eventually going to be known as Holy Roman Emperor, but when the Pope does it, he just calls him Roman Emperor. And let's think about this. Why would the Pope want to reward Charlemagne? Well, his grandfather, according to people in Europe, saved Christianity. They thought if the Muslims kept on invading, they would have conquered all of Europe and Christianity would have stopped existing. Even though, when we studied the Ottoman Empire and other Muslim groups, we know that other religions were allowed to coexist. But they thought all of Christianity would end. Charles Martel stopped that. Then his father, Pepin, saved the Pope from the Lombards, a barbarian group, gave him land. Charlemagne had been going and trying to keep all of the peoples in Europe that he interacted with Christian. He set up schools, sent missionaries out, and like I said, dealt harshly with those who defied Christianity. So the Pope crowns him Roman Emperor Christmas Day, the year 800. Now, one thing I do want you to note, so this was going to be Charlemagne's lands. We see the West Frankish Kingdom, the East Frankish Kingdom, the Kingdom of Italy. Now, what's going to be known as the Holy Roman Empire is going to change throughout time quite a bit. And you'll see different parts of the Frankish Kingdom, different parts of Italy being incorporated. And this will be the largest it ever is under Charlemagne. It will never be as big again. And we see this is pretty huge. present day France, present day Germany, lots of Eastern Europe, Northern Italy, Switzerland's in there, Belgium. It's huge. And he ruled all of this. But of course, he dies in Frankish law. He splits it. So let's talk about this Holy Roman Empire just a wee bit before we wrap up for today. All right, so it's mostly through history going to be Germany and northern Italy. We see just a difference. We have Charlemagne's kingdom, and below we have the traditional Holy Roman Empire. However, parts of Italy are often going to be omitted. In fact, for a lot of the time, Holy Roman Empire isn't going to even have the city of Rome in it. So people joke that it wasn't holy, it wasn't Roman, and it wasn't really an empire. Because typically the emperors didn't actually have a lot of power. The emperors were essentially vassals to the Pope and were, sometimes considered the sword of the Pope, going to do the military ends. This wasn't always the case. There's interesting readings, which maybe I'll pass on to you this week. I'm not sure which one I'm going to give you yet, where the Roman emperors asserted power. And there were times even that the Holy Roman Emperor would choose the next pope. It was rare because typically it was the other way around. So what the Holy Roman Empire truly was a collection of principalities. Now let's think about this. If you have a kingdom ruled by a king and, a duchy ruled by a duke, a empire ruled by an emperor, a principality is a place ruled by a prince. It's that simple. And so really this looks like one unified big block, but really would be like hundreds, if not thousands of little tiny dots, different colors ruled by a different person. And the emperor would loosely be able to suggest what they do. And, at times some of them were stronger and they would listen. At times people would just simply ignore them. Now, Charlemagne's empire is going to not last the test of time. You see, there's going to be a lot of invasions at the end of his life and then after he died. So once again, he splits his empire upon his death with his sons, as was custom. And we're going to have three groups coming into Europe at this time and attacking. We're going to have the Vikings attacking from the north. So the northern Holy Roman Empire, so northern France, actually it's going to be completely conquered. It's what Normandy is today. Britain, Ireland, invaded by the groups called the Vikings, who we'll get into soon. We're going to have Muslim invasions coming in. And we're going to have a group called the Magyars coming from Eastern Europe as well. So these three groups are coming in and they're destroying, looting towns, weakening the Holy Roman Empire and other kingdoms. And you see, we get to the crux of the situation. When we had the Roman Empire, there was protection and order. When we had the Roman Empire, we had it being mostly peaceful, except for all the invasions they did. But that wasn't there. Rome wasn't there anymore. Something needed to be done to protect the people, to stop all of this craziness. And feudalism is going to be the answer. All right. So I hope you guys enjoyed this lesson on early Europe, sometimes referred to as the Dark Ages. I hope you guys are well. Please do me a favor, hit that like button and maybe even that subscribe button. And that helps me go higher up in the algorithm so more people can see this history goodness. Don't forget to sing your songs. Have a great day, and I miss y'all. Bye-bye.